Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this last installment of the Summer History Talks from the Arizona Historical Society. I'm Janie Adams. I'm the History Engagement Manager, a staff historian, and an associate editor of the Journal of Arizona History, and I'm so happy that y'all are with us today. A little bit about the Arizona Historical Society. We were founded in 1864, and we collect, preserve, and tell the story of Arizona's past through museum exhibitions, libraries and archives, outreach, educational programs, and through publishing. AHS preserves our past, shares our state's stories, and connects people through the power of Arizona history. And support for all of that comes in part from our membership. If you're interested in programming like this or supporting more of the things that the Arizona Historical Society does, consider becoming a member. Members get free admission to all of our museums, special members-only events, and members pricing for programs, print copies of the Journal of Arizona History, which is such a nice perk to get in the mail, and so much more. Again, if you're interested in membership to the Arizona Historical Society, you can learn more about that at azhs.org. There are other things that you can do on our website. You can sign up for our email list. You can get all the links to all of our social media presence. You can explore all of our museum offerings, all of that and more, azhs.org. So some reminders for today's session. This is a webinar. So panelists and myself, we can't hear or see you. So if you have comments or questions, please put them in the Q&A feature. This is a pretty jam-packed session, so I can't guarantee that we will get to audience questions, but we will do our very best. All right, and without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers and we will get started. So Michael Brescia is a curator of ethnohistory at the Arizona State Museum and a professor of history at the University of Arizona. He is co-author with W. Dirk Bratt of Mexico and the United States, Ambivalent Vistas. He was the recipient of the Almerito from the Arizona Historical Society in 2023. Thomas Sheridan is a professor emeritus of the Southwest Center and School of Anthropology at the University of Arizona. He is the author of many published articles and books, including Arizona, Land of Sand, Seri Indians in the Struggle for Spanish Sonora, and Los Tusanenses, the Mexican community of Tucson. Kristen Dutcher-Mann is a professor of history and social studies and, professor of history and social studies education coordinator at the University of Arkansas, Little Rock, where she specializes in the history of colonial Latin America and U.S.-Mexican borderlands, in particular, bells, music, religion, and identity, mission music, and dance. And she is the author of The Power of Song, Music and Dance in the Mission Communities of Northern New Spain. Piper Milton is a PhD candidate in history at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and her research focuses on the environmental change in colonial New Mexico, and in particular, climate and weather of the 17th and 18th centuries. Anton Daughters is a professor of anthropology at Truman State University, and he is the author of Memories of Earth and Sea, an ethnographic history of the islands of, and you'll have to help me with this, Anton.
Chiloé.
Chiloé, thank you. He is also the co-editor of Moquis. Ooh, can you pronounce this book title for me too?
Moquis and Castillum. That's one of Tom's projects that didn't even get mentioned on his list since he's got so many.
And we are also hopeful that joining us at some point during the session will be Edward Jolie, the Clara Lee Tanner Associate Curator of Ethnology at the Arizona State Museum, and an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Arizona. He is out fulfilling his civic responsibility today, but we hope that he'll be able to join us at some point. Dr. Brescia, turning it over to you.
Okay, well, thanks so much. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome again. First and foremost, I want to express my gratitude to Janie Adams and the Arizona Historical Society for hosting today's roundtable discussion. I never tire in saying that I had the privilege of serving on Janie's MA thesis committee a few years back here at the University of Arizona, and it's so gratifying to see Janie go from being a superb graduate student to a stellar historian who knows how to keep the public engaged and informed. So thanks so much, Janie. I also want to acknowledge my friend and colleague, the editor of the Journal of Arizona History, David Turpey, whose leadership since 2018 has added so much scholarly depth and editorial professionalism to the study of our state's history. Not surprisingly, David has an expert team that helps him achieve all this, Janie being one, and also Chris Bradley. The idea for the special issue of the Journal of Arizona History, dedicated to Arizona under Spanish colonialism, emerged, interestingly enough, in the wake of an earlier special issue that examined the state of the field of Arizona history. My colleague in the Department of History, Catherine Morrissey, served as its guest editor. It was a special issue that's entitled Exploring Arizona's Diverse Past. It was published 5 years ago, and it's just this wonderful examination of existing scholarship and future directions. Professor Morrissey acknowledged in her own introduction to the special issue that the Spanish and Mexican periods warranted their own special issue. So David invited me, as someone who specializes in the Spanish colonial period of Mexican history. He invited me to serve as a guest editor. So while I was on academic leave, and I can't believe it's been 2 years, but back in the fall of 2023, I started to formulate an outline of how I envisioned telling this complex story of Arizona and Sonora and the Borderlands region, and quite significantly, who I wanted and who I needed to help me tell the story. The contributors to this special issue represent the best of multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary understandings of this region, and they come trained in methodologies shaped by history, cultural anthropology, ethnohistory, and all the spaces in between. To varying degrees, these scholars interpret the available archaeological and historical records to project nuanced understandings of borderlands as a concept, but also the dynamic interactions between indigenous peoples and Spanish colonial institutions, personalities, and systems. Meanwhile, floating around in what I guess you can call a conceptual background was the impending 250th anniversary of Tucson's founding, which we just commemorated a couple of weeks ago, but also the 250th anniversary of the battles of Lexington and Concord, which sparked the American Revolution. Of course, next year, we are celebrating the semi-quincentennial of the Declaration of Independence. So as guest editor, I wanted to integrate and make connections between these anniversaries in my introduction. So what I want to do before we start going through the questions that we have for our distinguished panel is to give a brief nod to each of their contributions. So I want to start off by saying that it takes, and I know anyone who knows anything about Arizona is going to agree with me on this, it takes a careful, experienced, and interdisciplinary scholar to identify and explain the complexities of the big picture. Who better to write the lead essay than Tom Sheridan? You will be hard-pressed to find a published history of Arizona, Sonora, or the southwestern borderlands that fails to cite one or more of Tom's publications. And it's no exaggeration, ladies and gentlemen, to say that much of what we know about Arizona history has been informed by Tom's research and scholarship. So in this special issue, Tom lays out the big picture for us. My colleague at the Arizona State Museum, Ed Jolie, as Janie mentioned, he's performing his civic duty. He brings multidisciplinary perspectives and interpretations to bear on the role of perishables, organic material culture, such as textiles, baskets, and footwear. And he looks at the role of perishables in shaping early Arizona history, particularly the subtle and not so subtle ways that technological innovation, identity, and population movement intersect and fashion social learning and cultural diffusion. Piper, in her essay, bridges environmental history with Spanish Catholic mission history, and she does so in very intriguing ways by establishing a baseline description of climatic and ecological data drawn from her evaluation of colonial documents and texts created mainly by the Jesuit missionaries. Kristen explains the cross-cultural understandings of sound in colonial settings, and her essay is an engaging and comprehensive treatment of soundscapes in Spanish and Indigenous Arizona. I just want to add that Kristen and I went to graduate school around the same time in the 90s. She was up at NAU, and I was here at the U of A. And in those early days of trying to become young budding scholars, Kristen and I served on many panels together in different historical academic conferences. So it was just, I was so delighted when Kristen agreed to join the special issue. And then finally, Anton, his essay adds critical comparative depth to our special issue by examining indigenous resistance to Spanish rule as part of a deeper cultural persistence among both the Hopi of northern Arizona and the Huiliche of southern Chile. So this is going to tell you that in Anton's contribution to the special issue, we're going to get two rims, the outer rim of Spanish colonial experience, the northern rim and the southern rim. So there's just kind of quick nods to our contributors and what they did. So I'll start off with the first question I have, and each panelist will have an opportunity to address it. And we want to think of the questions that I formulated, and Janie and David helped formulate, looks at the big picture. So the first question is, as historians and anthropologists who examine the history of Arizona-Sonoran Borderlands prior to 1821, and by the way, 1821 was the year Mexico got its independence from Spain. So as scholars of this time period and of this region, what sources did you draw from when you developed your article for the special issue? Let's start with Tom.
Well, Michael, you know, I spent the first half of my career working for a project on the Spanish colonial Southwest and northern Mexico. And so, you know, I was steeped in the original handwritten paleographic documents that are such a foundation for understanding the history of Arizona up to 1821. But what I learned very early, that despite the incredible richness of that documentary record, there were not only enormous biases, because they were all written by Europeans or Euro-Americans, primarily Spaniards. There were also enormous silences as well, because there were many aspects about Native American society and culture that the Spaniards either weren't aware of or didn't consider worthy of recording. So, for example, with the Hopis, we now know that the Hopis and other Pueblo peoples have these incredibly intricate religious ceremonies, but there are hardly any detailed descriptions of those ceremonies in the Spanish colonial record, because the Spaniards either dismissed them as superstition or attributed them to the work of the devil. So how do you get access to the thought, the feelings, the worldviews of the native peoples in this story? You know, it's a very one-sided story if you simply rely on the documentary record. So you have to consult the archaeological record. You have to consult the ethnological record, you know, detailed descriptions by historians and anthropologists of, you know, more contemporary Native Americans. And then you also have to consult the environmental record. You know, we're blessed with an incredible tree ring record that allows us to interpret with, you know, a remarkable degree of precision the environmental record of the past here, going back, you know, hundreds and hundreds of years. So I think my contribution to this issue is as much methodological as it is substantive, because I try and go through all the different sources of information I've tried to use, including oral histories and oral traditions.
And I think graduate students, when they get to read your intro essay, will help them formulate the different approaches to whenever they end up picking their topics for a thesis or a dissertation. So that's great, Tom. Thanks. Piper, how about yourself?
Thank you so much, Michael. And thank you again for having me be a part of this special issue as a PhD candidate. It's a really amazing opportunity to be working with a lot of names that pop up in my dissertation. And in terms of sources, I'm looking especially at a lot of missionary documents from Jesuits who are primarily German-speaking missionaries from across the Holy Roman Empire. There's been some really interesting sort of compilations and publications, especially of what were formerly private family correspondences between missionaries based in regions like Sonora, sent back to areas of what is now Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. And those have been a really interesting source, in addition to more sort of official annual reports and letters that are being circulated between Jesuits stationed in northwestern New Spain. So it's a really interesting combination of sort of more public and private facing documents, and looking at the ways that the environment, but particularly weather, is a thread across these sorts of correspondences, not just in terms of its material impact on sort of the day-to-day functions of attempting to establish missions, but also on the ways that climate and weather start to become used really frequently in the language of evangelization techniques that Jesuits employ, and looking at this as part of larger Jesuit missionary strategies in the 17th and 18th centuries.
Putting aside the limitations of projecting our own values into the past, I'm kind of curious, Piper. So were the Jesuits attuned to Mother Nature? The droughts and water sources, and do you get a sense of that they had a pretty good handle on the ecological landscapes, even obviously relying on indigenous peoples to help them?
Well, I would say that there's a lot of misinterpretation of traditional indigenous ecological knowledge, especially with waterway management and agriculture and foodways, which leads to some really devastating food scarcity, especially from the late 17th up through sort of the end of the Jesuit tenure in 1767. What's interesting is that a lot of the perceptions of environment and climate that we see circulating among sort of this late colonial generation of Jesuits are really informed by ideas that have been circulating in early modern Europe, especially sort of like a Hippocratic Galenic approach to trying to label certain climates as hot and cold or good and bad, and how that then was seen as impacting things like identity, even personality and health. And what we see is that a lot of this knowledge, obviously coming from the context of early modern Europe, is being misapplied in a climate and landscape that is totally unknown to Jesuits from the Holy Roman Empire. And it leads to some pretty devastating impacts, especially with attempts to construct permanent mission structures and settlements in floodplains, which was very commonly an issue.
Great. How about you, Kristen? Looking at soundscapes and music, and well, not just music, all different kinds of sounds.
Well, I would second what Tom said about the variety of sources that are necessary to tell a more complete story. So when I did my dissertation that then became a book, I have a giant database of missions in the United States and northern Mexico, and later communities, and all of the different kinds of sounds that were associated with them, mostly focusing on liturgical music and ceremonies for special occasions. But here I was a lot more interested in narrowing in on a specific place and then looking at broader patterns of sound, which is what I've become more interested in more recently. And so that really involves studying ethnographies, oral histories, songs, memoirs, I even have at my disposal at my university the Sequoia Center, which has the largest collection of native language newspapers in the country. And so I even went into the 20th century in these newspaper archives to look and see, you know, what's being said about horses or about bells or things like that. And even some of those things made their way into this essay. Another type of source that hasn't been mentioned yet would be vocabularies. So language is a particularly important part of sound. And of course, environmental records and archaeology are very important as well.
I noticed when you mentioned looking at 20th century newspapers, I noticed Tom nodding his head in approval. I know in Tom and Anton's research with the Hopi, drawing from Hopi knowledge today to shed light and perspective on the documentary record. So Anton, in your case, you're looking at the outer rims, right, of both on the Spanish Empire, but the north and the south. And did you have to look at different sources for each area, or were there common sources between the two?
Definitely different sources since the regions are so far apart. So yeah, I was looking at indigenous groups in the south, the very south of Chile, around, you know, where Patagonia, you see the beginnings of Patagonia. And then, of course, northern Arizona at the Hopi. In the case of southern Chile, I was relying on some good primary source documents accounts written by explorers, late 1500s, early 1600s, that the government of Chile has done a great job of preserving and making really publicly accessible. And then there was some excellent secondhand sources, some great historians down there. Some of them are local historians from the islands where I do my research, who have gone on to write some fantastic histories of that colonial period. I'll mention a couple of them just to put the names out there. Rodolfo Urbina Burgos, just an incredible historian, and Renato Cárdenas Álvarez. I'll say one more thing about the primary source documents in Chile. If anybody happens to be interested in accessing some of those, as I mentioned, the government of Chile has done a great job of making them publicly accessible. And there's a great site you can go to where a lot of that stuff has been pulled together. These are primary source documents spanning, you know, the 16th through 19th centuries. It's called Memoria Chilena, a really good site. I don't think there's any equivalent here in the United States that looks at our own deeper past. When it came to the Hopi, it was similar. These were documents, a lot of which, this is from the Hopi History Project, which was actually spearheaded by Tom Sheridan. We were drawing on documents that had been collected from archives in various parts of Mexico and Spain. And now you can find copies of all those primary source documents at OER, at the Arizona State Museum on the campus of the University of Arizona. And those documents are, some of them are court records, some of them written by explorers, others are written by missionaries. So there's a great collection of primary source material there for the Hopi, and of course I was looking specifically at the 1500s and 1600s in the piece that I put together. But the other thing that I'll mention, and the reason it was a different source materials, is kind of building on what a couple people have mentioned already. Oral traditions of the Hopi, and one of the things that Tom did during this project was organize some meetings with Hopi elders. We went up to the Hopi reservation several times, recorded a lot of those interactions, presented documents, information that was in primary source documents to them, recorded a lot of times their responses, and there was some great insights we got from that. Different perspectives than, of course, what you would find in documents written by a Spanish explorer in the 1500s and 1600s. And those contemporary perspectives we were able to use to to maybe problematize a little bit, the perspective that's just baked into the primary source documents.
That's a great way to sort of transition to the second question, Anton. Thanks. So as contributors to the special issue, you come from different disciplines and you employ various conceptual frameworks, theoretical frameworks when you drafted your articles. From your perspective, why is Arizona-Sonora history prior to 1821, why is that history so interdisciplinary from the scholarly perspective? So Tom, I mean, your answers to the first question obviously speak to that. Can you kind of flesh it out a little more from your perspective? Why is the Borderlands region so interdisciplinary?
Sure, Michael. Well, the first thing is that as far as archaeology goes, the southwestern United States was one of the premier anthropological laboratories in the entire world in the late 19th and for much of the 20th centuries, because you not only had spectacular pre-Columbian remains like the Pueblo cliff dwellings, the Hohokam great houses like Casa Grande, and the canal system, which was the largest canal system in all of pre-Columbian North America. So you had all of that drew their attention, but then you also had living native people who had deep historic ties to those pre-Columbian cultures. And so that baked in a lot of interdisciplinary perspectives, first between archaeologists and cultural anthropologists, but then historians as well. And I think I came out of a tradition in anthropology that was deeply historical, because I did get an opportunity to take a couple of independent studies from Edward Spicer, who still is the premier ethnohistorian of the region. But before that, one of my first mentors in anthropology was Hank Dobbins, who studied under Spicer. Right. So when I was learning anthropology, I was also learning history. And then when I came to the University of Arizona, as I said, much of my early career was working for the Documentary Relations of the Southwest, started by Jesuit historian Charles Polzer, and steeping myself in that documentary record. So I feel like I was lucky to be the heir to all of these kind of intersecting interdisciplinary currents.
Okay. Curiosity, when you were in grad school, Tom, did you take any courses in the Department of History?
I did not. I took courses in geography, but in history, I kind of learned on the job. Right. And you worked for DRSW as well, Michael. And
right.
Basically, we took graduate students and threw them into the primary documents. And, you kind of had to sink or swim. You had to learn the paleography. If you didn't know a lot about Spanish colonial history of not just Arizona and Sonora, but the entire borderlands, you kind of had to learn it on the job.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much what I did.
A baptism by fire, right?
Yeah.
Piper, why do you think the Arizona-Sonora, the borderlands in general, why is it so interdisciplinary? What's your take on that?
I think there's a lot of reasons, and some of them have already been commented on, but especially as someone who looks a lot at missionaries, obviously there's a lot of gaps and silences in the primary source record that need to be filled and addressed. And I think the last few decades, the last sort of 30 years, especially, there's been so much growth in environmental history and in reaching out to sources. And I think tree ring analysis was already mentioned, other type of climatic data that can help to reconstruct or fill in some gaps. But I think beyond that, also just because of the nature of a lot of the written primary source material, you have to look often to archaeology or art historical records or other types of records to attempt to reconstruct this pre-1821 period in a meaningful way.
Okay, thanks. Kristen?
I would say the interdisciplinarity in my work is something I learned from my advisor, Susan Deeds, who trained me well in ethnohistorical methods. And, you know, you absolutely have to use them when the documentary record is so lopsided, the written record. I think also in borderlands regions like Arizona, Sonora, when you have communities that are willing to work with you to help understand the past in a more responsible way, that has been such a remarkable development. And so I was very much inspired by the Hopi History Project to look at ways in which more descendant communities can be involved in rereading the Spanish record in addition to their oral tradition. And then my book, when it was published, got a Library of Congress call number in the musicology section instead of in the history section, even though I'm a historian. Right. And so I've actually had, I think, a lot more people engaged with the work that I've done from the musicology side than from the mission history side of things. And that has been such a fruitful road to follow as well, sound studies and historical musicology and ethnomusicology. And I've benefited tremendously from those methods as well.
I like how you put it, interpreting history, the past, in a responsible way. And I think that's why interdisciplinarity is so key, because to present as complete a picture as possible. You know, as historians, we just can't rely on one discipline or one methodology. We need to go beyond that. Or anthropologists just can't rely on anthropological theory, right? We have to go beyond that. Anton?
Could I just interject one thing, Michael? You know, I'm picking up on what Kristen said. I didn't take courses in history, but Susan Deeds, Tom Barnes, many of the early people who worked on the DRSW project were grad students in history at the time. So
that's right.
Again, I learned a tremendous amount from Susan, a tremendous amount from Tom Barnes, from Tom Naylor, and even though she didn't work for DRSW, from Cynthia Ratting, who was working for ENA Sonora at the time. So again, it was that kind of learning from your fellow graduate student colleagues, who again came from multidisciplinary backgrounds.
Well, Tom, in your earlier part of your response about the DRSW, the Documented Relations of the Southwest, I mean, I think you nailed it. To be a graduate student, you're interacting with history and anthropology and archaeology all the time, whether it's formal coursework or more likely getting your hands into the primary source materials, but then being exposed to archaeology, anthropology, ethnohistory, and and Anton, you were part of the DRSW, the Office of Ethnohistorical Research. So, what's your perspective on interdisciplinarity of our region?
I don't know if there's a whole lot I can add. With all the great points here, other than it occurs to me, I mean, it is a real cultural crossroads, that region. You're looking at so many different Native American groups, and then, of course, the region was claimed by Spain and Mexico and the United States, and that maybe, in a way, that draws scholars with lots of different backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, but also disciplinary backgrounds as well. You have a lot of fantastic scholars from Mexico, or European scholars and American scholars that are looking at this region. And so just by virtue of that, you're probably going to get quite a disciplinary mix.
You mentioned scholars in Mexico. One of the takeaways that I had looking at all the peer reviews, because this special issue is peer reviewed, right? Reminding all of us, let's not forget our colleagues south of the international border who are doing such important research and interpretations. So that was one, it just reminded me, we always have to remember that. So each article in this special issue, and it is scheduled to come out issue 3 of the autumn 2025. So in the next couple of months, it'll be out, ladies and gentlemen. But each article in the special issue examines a crucial topic that helps us better understand the Arizona-Sonoran Borderlands under Spanish rule. So my question to the distinguished panelists, from your perspective, it's a two-part question. What are some of the emerging trends in the study of the Arizona-Sonoran Borderlands, and where would you like to see the field go? Tom?
Boy, that's a really big question. I think one of the primary directions that it is going, and I would hope that it would encourage, well, two things. First of all, I really second your acknowledgement of our Mexican colleagues, and I don't think there's enough interaction between us. Actually, when I was a grad student, there was more than there is now, because Sonora had not only 1, but 2 annual historical conferences. And there would be a fairly large contingent of both professors like Mike Myers, Charlie Polser, Bunny Fontana, Jim Officer, and graduate students who would go down to those conferences and give presentations. So I think we really need to bring more structure to those interactions, because I think that structure has been weakened now. The second thing is to encourage, obviously, more Native perspectives on this period. And I think partly that's through treating Native people as colleagues and as partners rather than as subjects. But it's also as Native people, take control of their own sovereignty more. You have these initial periods where a lot of Native, whether they're Hopi or Apache or Atom, they may go into the, administration, they may go into health fields, they go into, some of the basic needs that their people have. But I think now there's more and more who are becoming archaeologists or historians like Ed Jolie. And I think their perspectives have been and are going to be absolutely critical for this interdisciplinary perspective to really, really, become mainstream.
Okay. Thanks, Tom. Piper?
Yeah, that is a big question. Something that I've seen more and more just in the last few years, maybe the last decade, is the growth of expanding the discussion of history of science, especially to more of these regions that I think historically have been seen as sort of peripheral, especially in studies of sort of like the Spanish Empire as a whole. The most recent issue of the Journal of Jesuit Studies had an amazing article, I'm blanking on the author's name, that was specifically looking at the northwestern region of New Spain and sort of materia medica and sort of history of science questions that I think have really been concentrated often in and around Mexico City and has put that in dialogue with Europe. So I think expanding that geographic focus, but also including a lot of indigenous ecological knowledge and traditional practices and this sort of broader global exchange of materials and medical and scientific materials and knowledge that includes very much beyond sort of the missionary perspective and the missionary travel and trade routes. So I'm really excited to see more and more of sort of this widening of a global early modern history of science that has a broader geographic range. And I'm also excited how that's been tied into a growth in sensory history, especially in regions like olfactory history. There's some really new and exciting works, and I think that sort of segues into Kristen's research on soundscapes, but I think it's a really exciting time, especially in this sort of pre-19th century period, to look at sensory studies in general.
Okay, great. Kristen?
Well, I would agree with everything that Tom and Piper have said so far. I definitely think that the incorporation of Indigenous knowledge has benefited this field tremendously, and I'd like to see more of that in the future. And I know that the Hopi History Project was funded in part by an NEH grant, and so I certainly hope that we can continue to see that kind of support from our government, and of course from the Mexican government as well, as we strive to tell stories that go across borders, disciplinary borders, geographic borders. All of these things can hinder us when we're trying to tell a more complete story of the past. I also am very interested in the ways in which we need to, as scholars, interact with the public and with our colleagues in K-12 education, which is another reason I love the Hopi History Project, because they're attempting to do that. Because I think that our work will never be disseminated widely unless we are able to better speak in public forums and to and with the public about why what we do matters, and also have our story of early Arizona colonial history, right, be the story that's told in elementary school textbooks, instead of, you know, here's Coronado and here's Keno, and then bam, United States.
Right. Putting aside the issue of funding, my colleague at the Arizona State Museum, Dale Brenneman, she's been working for a while now on the Tono Ato and integrating them, you know, so indigenous knowledge, indigenous perspectives, and, you know, the longer term goal, because of the funding issue, gets a little thorny of, you know, putting things online and having it accessible. So that's an exciting project that she's been working on. How about you, Anton? Where should the field be going?
Well, the shift, if you can identify a trend in anthropology over the last few decades, a general trend, it's to just find ways, by whatever means, to incorporate more voices of the communities that we are writing about. And whether that's through oral histories, through memories, interviews, or, as a couple of you have mentioned, more people being formally trained in anthropologists and becoming scholars and then going back and studying their own communities. So that's been a trend in anthropology, I suspect in history as well. And in terms of where the field should be going, certainly it should continue going in that direction until there's, you know, more or less a kind of I guess a more level representation of all communities. Conceptually, that what that does is I think it leads to a shift in the kinds of conceptual focuses that we take in anthropology to focusing more, emphasizing more agency, members of communities as more conscious actors, you know, over the course of history, rather than portraying them as victims of these larger structural forces. So I think that's something that's happened as well in anthropology and is going to continue to happen.
In fact, all the contributions to the special issue really are emerging trends. And that's what I think is exciting about this. So I'm looking forward to it coming out and having the Arizona Historical Society membership And then it's just scholarly community across, across the country, around the globe. It'll be accessible looking at some of these emerging trends that show up in each of your contributions. Janie, do we have time for one more, or we need to open it up to the public now, or?
No, we have time for one more. Doesn't look like we have any questions for the public yet.
Okay, so the last question, again, piggybacking on all the other previous ones, what advice would you give a student who expresses interest in researching the history of the borderlands? Tom?
Again, that's a huge question. I think the advantages now are there are some incredible records that have been digitized that are available free and online, like the DRSW Master Bibliography, and where you can literally go in and search. We estimate about 500,000 pages of primary Spanish colonial documentation for people, places, keywords, subject matter, whatever. And there's also record groups like Mission 2000 that Don Garate down at Tumacacre National Historical Park did, where they have done the same thing to basic mission records on births, deaths, baptisms, etc., where they list the names of the people. They, whether they were the comadre or compadre, they list, in many cases, the ethnicity. And I'm currently working with Carl Herring on a project for the Pascua Yaqui tribe, where we're looking at Yaqui presence in southern Arizona much earlier than the sort of dominant narrative that most Yaquis living in Arizona came here as political refugees during the times of Porfirio Diaz to escape the genocidal policies of Diaz prior to the Mexican Revolution. And using Mission 2000, we were able to show that after the Autumn, the Yaquis were far and away the biggest indigenous group represented in that Mission 2000 database.
Wow.
I think in anthropology, you have to become much more collaborative. The days of an anthropologist going up to whatever tribal native nation that they wanted to study and sort of, setting up shop are over, because native nations are taking more control over their sovereignty, including their cultural sovereignty. So now, you have to get permission if you want to do it responsibly. You have to work with native nations and whatever cultural apparatuses they have to carry out work. So it may take a little bit more groundwork to make that happen, but I think in the long run, it's going to be so much more fruitful to work collaboratively with your native colleagues.
Now, Piper, you are a PhD student, right? And I'm sure you're seeing the light at the end of the tunnel.
We hope.
Yeah,
Yeah, I actually just finished teaching a summer course for UC Santa Cruz on colonial Latin America. So I've been thinking about this a lot, and going off of, I think it's been mentioned a couple times, the importance of how much is getting digitized now and how much that has allowed undergraduate students that I've worked with to feel like they can start to explore some of these topics. And I think the impact during the pandemic, one of the positive things is that I did see this massive increase in sort of primary and secondary sources becoming more easily accessible online. And that's had a huge impact on the students that I see every quarter in sort of broadening their understanding of topics. And I think, especially as people who are also in a position, not just doing their own research, but often teaching and working with undergraduate students or in the K through 12 system, using that position to really lobby for increased access. And whether that's, working with the library, which I've done on an academic senate committee at Santa Cruz, but finding ways to increase availability and using the position as an instructor or faculty member to really help undergraduate students have access. Because I think sometimes, especially in sort of the pre-19th century topics, it can feel really daunting and limiting, particularly depending on language skills or funding for things like travel. I think anything we can do to make accessing sources more equitable and using our positions to help undergraduate students as well as my fellow grad students access those resources is really going to improve and change the undergraduate landscape.
And these are certainly crucial issues. Thank you. Kristen?
I would say to make sure to not silo yourself in a specific geographic area or time period or even methodology, and to ask really broad questions that might take you to different fields, like ecology or sound studies or archaeology, and then find people to help you understand the literature in that field. I think I've benefited so much from collaborations with people who work in other fields, but similar times and spaces that I do. And so I always encourage students to do that as well. And I also think you can never have too much language. So I encourage people to keep up language studies and learn really as much language as you can.
That's one of the things that I push, the language skills, sharpen the Spanish skills. It's one thing, you need a reading knowledge. All right, that's fine, but you need to go beyond that. You need to go to Hermosillo, you need to go to Mexico City. Obviously it's about funding too, grants and everything, but Seville, Madrid, and get those language skills, not just the reading, but the oral comprehension, the listening, and even some writing skills. And I think that also opens you up for Mexicans and Spaniards who are interested in the colonial period to invite you to do things. And that broadens your sort of professional network. So, Anton, what advice would you give students?
Well, I'm thinking in terms of anthropology students, cultural anthropology students. I would tell them really embed yourselves deeply in the community that you're interested in. And to kind of build off of Kristen's point, you don't have to silo yourself off with that community, but you do really need to ground yourself in that community and establish strong ties over long periods of time and keep coming back and find as many ways as possible to include the voices of those individuals in your work, and to include them in a direct way. Use direct quotes, don't obfuscate, which sometimes in cultural anthropology you see a lot of jargon being used that can kind of hide a little bit some of the more interesting ethnographic details. And then later, as you're putting together scholarship, find those connections with other disciplines. And anthropology is really an inherently interdisciplinary area of inquiry, and so make connections to scholarship in public health, or use the work of archaeologists and historians and sociologists, demographers. There are just so many different areas that anthropology can connect to. So I think I'm kind of echoing what a lot of people have already said. Embrace the interdisciplinary nature of anthropology, but I would add also really get to know a community well, so you can establish strong ties, and maybe bring some of those individuals in as colleagues and collaborators in the work that you do.
Yeah, one of the expressions we use is armchair historian or the armchair scholar. You want to avoid that. You want to get off your chair and go into the community. And I experienced that For example, the Navajo Nation, when I was called in to serve as a consultant and expert witness on some water rights disputes, I went up to Window Rock. I interacted with Navajos. I wanted to get a sense of what was going on the ground and why the water issue was so important. Or in northern New Mexico, the Hispano communities and their acequias, going up there and spending time with them and learning, instructing, learning from them, and that would inform my own approaches. So this is a very productive and vibrant discussion. Thank you so much. Janie, any questions from the general public?
Yeah, and I think we'll start with a question from me and then go into questions from the general audience. And maybe Kristen, you want to start with an answer, and then if folks have something to contribute, they can. But I think Kristen, you had mentioned kind of the K through 12 connection and kind of expanding that to the public history connection. So, how can we help school teachers and school children connect to this history? Being a public historian, interacting with kids a lot, you get the kind of questions that are like, wow, was life in color before 1964? So, how do we get the public history lens, the K through 12 education lens, how do we help them connect with our work?
A great question. One I've spent a lot of time thinking about, teaching both history of the American West, U.S. history to 1877, and social studies teaching methods this fall. And the work intersects in so many places. But one thing I always wish I had, and I know I hear this from K-12 teachers all the time, is short video content that could be understandable for general public, but that was easily accessible on a YouTube channel that could be used by K-12 teachers to illustrate specific points about these early interactions. For example, the topics we're talking about right now. Like if you search right now things about Coronado or the Pueblo Revolt, you're going to find some not so great resources, or some resources that don't tell the kind of story that, for example, the Hopi History Project tells as short YouTube content. So how can we make our work more accessible by providing high quality produced short video content, podcasts, things like that, that the general public would see? Likely my first idea.
I'll just throw in a quick commentary. A couple of years ago, I was on sabbatical down in this region of southern Chile where I do research. It's an archipelago, cluster of islands there. And I had the opportunity to just work with the high school, the local high school. It was a boarding school. And I just had a lot of fun. They just asked me to come in. I was working with the historians there. And they said, why don't you just come in and talk a little bit about your research and also a little bit about, your vision of the past here, this region. And so I spent a few weeks just, the teachers were kind enough to sort of give me some of their classes and had a great time interacting directly with the high school kids down there.
Well, I'd like to say, that I've given, guest talks in a number of NEH summer seminars for teachers, for K through 12 teachers. And it's been, incredibly rewarding. Again, is that funding going to continue? We're all worrying about that. So, I think what Kristen says is, we do, one of the biggest silos is academia in general. And, if after spending my career in academia, it in many respects is a really bizarre subculture. And, we're so immersed in it that we often lose sight of how limiting it can be. And I think anything that gets us out and gets us interacting with with other types of audiences is a good thing. But I've got to say, you know, I'm getting near the end of my career, and it's been so rewarding to take part in this dialogue, because, you know, I've known Anton now for probably 30, 35 years, but to hear the kind of questions that Kristen and Piper are asking are questions that never would have occurred to me. And I think that's a really, really encouraging sign.
And that's why we're so hopeful for the future of scholarship, but also public engagement.
Right.
Piper or Dr. Brescia, would you like to add anything before we take the next question?
I think the thing that I'll add, and this sort of tacks on to when I mentioned that sensory history is a really exciting emergent area. I've also seen a lot of recent museum exhibits sort of across the US and also in Europe and a couple in other global regions that have really been taking like an immersive sensory approach. There was one that was super interesting that was sort of resurrecting extinct plant smells. That information was gathered from indigenous communities in Hawaii and also from missionary records. And I think that there's a lot of potential ways that emergent research on our geographic area can be translated into more sort of publicly accessible spaces like museums. And sensory studies, I think, is one approach through things like olfactory history or soundscapes that are like immersive, that this is a really great opportunity to bring this type of study into places outside of sort of the traditional campus or classroom.
I would just say, you know, much like the panelists, I've done a lot of K through 12 teacher workshops over the years, but it wasn't until this past spring semester, that I actually went into a middle school classroom. I was invited to go, and I really was joggling my mind. How am I going to talk to 12-year-olds, right? I mean, it's easy to talk to teachers, and I've done a lot of public outreach with a general audience, mostly retirees, but K through 12. So I brought in, from my own collection, historical documents, rare books from Mexico from the colonial period. I brought in gloves, had them line up, and they got excited. You know, it was like a show and tell. I brought in images. I had a PowerPoint, videos embedded, and that, sort of easily digestible parts, and kind of worked them through it. And the classroom that I went into, I spent just one day, but it was a full day. There were a lot of Spanish speakers, but also indigenous students. So I was able to integrate their knowledge and experiences. And I left there I said, all right, I got to do this now at least once every academic year to kind of to maintain that. So I made a commitment to the teacher. I'm coming back. I'm going to come back. So, but I'm just one, right? We need to have sort of a momentum of my colleagues in the history department doing this, or in the anthropology department doing this, and getting it out there.
Yeah, I know that, all the young people I know think that what I do for work is that I'm Indiana Jones, and they're kind of disappointed.
Right.
They're kind of disappointed when it's not quite like that, but some days it is. All right, so the last question that I'd like to address is kind of circling back to that access question, right? So access to not only kind of primary source documents here in the United States, and then in Mexico, and maybe even in Spain, but also access to the skills that you need to read those documents, to interpret those documents. Where does someone even start if they are, say, a novice?
Well, Tom addressed this earlier, in the sense that it's getting your hands dirty. It's really just you jump into the doc. You have to have some background in Spanish, of course. You just can't look at a 16th century document and start reading it. So you need to have a base of a base knowledge, if you will, of Spanish language skills. On the other hand, there are also paleography courses that are available, and a lot of grad students, I've directed them. The Newberry Library, the John Carter Brown Library has offered them, where you can formal classes, they're workshops, they're talleres, as they would say in Spanish, workshops that introduce you to both the method and the discipline of paleography, which is study of old handwriting. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's just doing it, getting the documents and going through them line. It's tedious. And I tell my grad students, you want to be a historian, that at the end of a paleography day, and you want to keep going. That's why a lot of my grad students want to do the modern period. They don't have to worry about old handwriting. It's all either typescript or easy to read handwriting. So that kind of separates the colonialists from the modernists, for those who want to put the time in and the effort in to get through line by line. And Tom, you've done that going back decades, right? The DRSW Master Index, your name shows up all over the place. Every document you had to meticulously go through and identify. So your paleography is up there.
Well, it used to be, Michael. I don't know about today, but I'm thinking about you and Kristen both talked about language skills, and one summer in the early 70s, I went down and took a intensive Spanish language class in Cuernavaca, and then on my way back up to the border, I decided to hitchhike, and I would go into a cantina, different cantina every night, and I would buy one beer and strike up a conversation. And I not only improved my Spanish, but I often drank for free for the way. So that may be a kind of a user-friendly way to work on your language skills.
And for grad students where the budget is quite limited,
yeah, that's right.
That's one way to provide beverage.
I'd like to make one, my ties with the Historical Society go back to the early 1980s, when I was director of the Mexican Heritage Project from 1982 to 84. And I just want to congratulate Janie and David Turpey for the outstanding job you're doing with the journal. It has been so exciting to see all of the new directions that the journal is, willing to take, and all of the new perspectives and new voices that you're drawing into the journal. Because, there were times in the past when the Historical Society seemed to be the province of, white pioneer nostalgics. And I don't think you can say that about the organization today.
Well, I'm so glad I fixed my connection problem to hear that compliment. Well, everyone, I thank you so much for being with us today. I don't know if I started asking a question about access, but we're running over time, so I sent an email about that. Thank you so much for your time today, for joining us. Thank you so much for collaborating with us on our special issue of the journal. And like Dr. Brescia said, we're hopeful that that issue of journal will be in members' mailboxes in the next couple months and available online through Project Muse very, very soon.
Well, thank you, Janie. And thanks to all the panelists for participating in what I think was a very productive and engaging roundtable. It was a conversation, so it was great. Thanks.
Thanks, y'all. Take care.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Be well.
Bye.
Have a great fall semester.
Thank you.